I want to tell you just a quick story. First, I just want to welcome you. Glad you can be a part of Anchor Church, what we're doing here. I'm excited to share with you today. I want to tell you a story just about stress and anxiety. Not from this past week, but from when I was 5 years old. When I was five, I have this very vivid memory. It's actually become something that in some ways I feel like I keep looking back. It's almost like this touchstone or a mile marker. I don't know why. But when I was 5 years old, I had a really bad ear infection. So my ear was hurting. I was laying on the couch with like a heating pad on my ear. I had a fever. And I remember looking up at the ceiling. I think it was like one of those, it was just your average ceiling. But as I looked up at the ceiling, I don't know if it's because of the fever or what it was, but I just felt like I was seeing like all of these dots like in the ceiling. Like I don't know if it was my imagination or the fever, but there was just all these dots covering the ceiling, and they were making different shapes and stuff. But in my 5-year-old brain, each one of those dots represented a problem that existed. They weren't all my problems. They were kind of like the problems of the world. And I just remember like just seeing them all. And for some reason, I just became overwhelmed with the sense that here are all these problems and I can't solve them. And I remember almost really having, I don't know if you'd call it a panic attack or I wouldn't think it was a mental breakdown. I was 5 years old. But I felt this overwhelming anxiety and burden of just sensing that there was some things that were wrong or some problems in front of me and I could not solve them. And so it feeds into really my personality. On the Enneagram, I'm a 9. I kind of want to fix things. I want to make things I want to make things better. I want everybody to get along. I want there to be peace. And it's my way of dealing with turmoil. Sometimes, like maybe right now, there are situations, there's times where I feel powerless. And because I can't make peace, because I have limited power, I get stressed, I get anxious, I get overwhelmed. But you don't know anything about stress or anything about anxiety, do you? Right? I mean, obviously, we're dealing with a global crisis right now with coronavirus. And what is it that's causing so much anxiety? The lack of control, right? That we can't shake spring breakers by their shoulders and tell them to do the right thing. That we can't stop family members and friends from posting misinformation and conspiracies on their social media. We can't stop the endless loop of news coverage and the ever-changing guidelines that seem to be new every hour. And all of this is changing and going so fast that it's hard for us to keep a grasp on what exactly is happening and what we should do. And all of that just builds so much anxiety and stress. And that's not even taking into account, that's talking about, there's the stress of us worrying about those that we love and care about who are at risk, certainly care about our children and their well-being. But that's not even scratching the surface, is it? Because there's the financial anxiety, not just as a nation or as a world, but personally in our homes, like wondering how we're going to pay bills, how are we going to make ends meet, providing for our families, keeping our jobs. All of this is happening at the same time and so quickly. And all of this is happening on top of all of the normal stress and anxiety that you and I have learned to carry over the years. Just part and parcel of living in our culture. The stress of losing a job or moving or not moving, of broken relationships or the death of someone that you love. Maybe the betrayal that you've experienced or you've dealt out. Or maybe watching your child go down a path and you know where that path goes, and yet you're powerless to stand in the way and stop them. Sometimes there's things in our lives that happen, and we just sense this growing, strengthening knot in our stomach of anxiety and stress and worry. And what do we do about it? I know as Christians often we walk away feeling guilty about it. People who say they trust and believe and have faith in God often beat themselves up and they think, well, listen, like if I'm feeling stress and anxiety, there's got to be something wrong with my faith because I know God is a provider. I know God cares about me. And so if I'm stressing out, if I'm worrying, if I'm anxious, I'm doing something wrong. Like there's something must be wrong with me. My faith must be weak. Not just something's wrong with me, but something must be wrong with my relationship with God. And if you don't want to go through with what God has put in front of you, well, maybe you just don't love him enough, right? Maybe that's the issue. Because if you loved God enough, whatever he put in front of you, you would just gladly take it. You'd be like, all right, I can trust. I know it's going to work out, and I'll do that. Well, here's the deal. If that's true, if that idea that the Christian or the person of faith has no stress, no anxiety, and no worry, or at least it's not lasting, if that's true, then we have a problem because Jesus blew it. If that's true, then Jesus did something wrong. Did you know that Jesus felt incredibly distressed, overwhelmed with anxiety and emotion? He was incredibly sad and depressed. Listen, Jesus did not want to do what God the Father wanted him to do. And you might be thinking, wait, Jesus is our role model here for humanity. He always wanted to do the will of the Father, right? Not according to Mark 14. Let's look at this together. Are you ready? Mark 14, starting in verse 32. They went to a place called Gethsemane, and Jesus said to his disciples, "Sit here while I pray." He took Peter, James, and John along with him, and he began to be deeply distressed and troubled. So Jesus is with his closest friends. He takes his closest friends, those three, a little further with him into the garden, further than the others. Why? Well, first of all, probably because they were the closest of friends. So maybe support? Because look what happens next. It says that he was deeply distressed and troubled. That phrase, deeply distressed, it really means overwhelmed. He had an excessive anxiety. He had so much stress that his disciples probably could just see it in his face. And they see him basically fall apart. Now listen, after all they had seen Jesus do and say, all of the times that Jesus had showed courage and strength in the face of challenges and in the face of authorities. Think about that. And now they must have this look of shock because here Jesus is, the one that they've seen so fearless in front of everyone else. And he's losing it. He's fallen apart. And look what he tells them next. Verse 34. "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death," he said to them. "Stay here and keep watch." He's saying that he's depressed, saddened to the point of death. Like he'd rather not be alive right now. Why in the world is Jesus going through all of this? Why is he feeling this anxiety, this depression? Because this is the Passion Week, and this is his last night before he'll be arrested and crucified. He knows what's happening and what's coming tomorrow. In just a matter of hours, he'll be arrested and he'll go to the cross. And he's known this for a while. He's been telling his disciples, but now it's here. Now it's real. Have you ever felt like that? I think I feel most like that when I'm on vacation or I'm going to go to a new place. Like I know Lindsay will ask me weeks in advance, like, "Are you getting excited? Are you excited?" And like I answer like, "Well, yeah." Like I know in my mind that I'm going to enjoy myself, that it's going to be great. But there's something where I just can't, I'm not really feeling it. In fact, it doesn't really happen until maybe the night before when we're setting our alarm to wake up early to get to the airport, or even when we're at the airport, getting our luggage, pulling it off the curb, going into the airport and going through. That's when I actually start feeling excited. Then I get this sense of okay, it's about to happen, right? The same thing is true in many areas of our lives, right? I'm sure many of you felt like this the night before your wedding, right? Excitement, a little of anxiety and fear of what this means because you know life will never be the same, or maybe with having a child, right? You are excited, but then it's not real until suddenly you go home and there's this dawning reality of the gravity of the moment and the situation that you're in. And that's exactly what's happening here, because the same feeling that you and I sometimes feel with good things can also be very true with challenging things. I mean, have you ever done a race? Have you ever ran? It doesn't matter if it's like a 5K or a marathon. The first time you run a certain race, there's this dawning awareness that comes to you the night before that says, oh man, I'm doing something I haven't done before and it's going to be hard. Will I be able to do it? Will I be able to rise to the challenge? And it's so much worse. It's so much worse than it can be something like surgery or a funeral or a breakup or a divorce. There's a sinking feeling, right? Maybe it's if for some reason financially things have fallen apart and you're losing your home, or there's this feeling like, I don't know what I'm going to do right now. I don't know how I'm going to handle this. Some people experience that even when they're maybe in a job for a long time and they think this is where I'm going to end my career, and then it's gone, it's lost. There's this feeling of what? I don't know what to do. And so even though Jesus knew this time was coming for some time, he'd been teaching his disciples, this is going to happen. The reality is hitting him like a brick wall. And listen, it's easy to forget that Jesus was both fully human and fully God. He was both divine and human. He didn't give up his divine nature. He gave up his rights and privileges. But he was still fully human as well. He was born and lived his life in a human body with human feelings and emotions. Jesus was a human being. In Hebrews, it says that he had to become like us in every way, including having a will and having desires. And in his humanness, in his weakness, he realized that he needs help, that he's overwhelmed, that he's at the end of his rope of what he can handle on his own. And so what does he do? He reaches out to his Father in heaven. And in his humanness and in his weakness, he started to grasp the reality of what was about to happen. And he realizes that it's too much for him. He doesn't want it. Jesus didn't want to go to the cross. And listen, we have this idea in our mind that sometimes that Jesus went not only willingly, but skipping, and that this was this great thing. I mean, we celebrate it on Easter, and it's a happy day that Jesus rose from the dead. But we lose sight of the fact that Jesus, what he's doing here is difficult for him. He's looking at this situation and he's overwhelmed. And right here he's in this moment where he says, I don't think I can do this. And so he brings some friends with him and he goes further into the garden to pray. And remember, this has been the model Jesus has been showing his disciples, his apprentices. He's been showing this rhythm over and over again, that as he lives his life, he tries to reconnect. He goes and reconnects to the Father through silence and solitude, through prayer and fasting. And so he's doing that here too. He knows what to do when he needs power and strength and courage. He prays. So I just have to tell you something before we go any further. If you find yourself stressed, anxious, overwhelmed to the point of death, you're not a bad person. You're not a weak person. You're not an unspiritual person. You're just a human being. A human being with all the weaknesses and insecurities that we all share, and even that Jesus had. Having these feelings doesn't disappoint God. I think they're meant to point us to him. And that's what we see Jesus do here. These feelings drive him to reach out, to recognize his dependence on God the Father. But notice how he prays in verse 35. Going a little further, he fell to the ground and prayed that if possible the hour might pass from him. The Greek here alludes to this being a repeated thing, like Jesus falling and praying. So he's troubled, and Jesus is literally falling again and again. He's losing control of his body. That's the level of anxiety that Jesus is feeling. And he's just praying these words again and again. And I think Jesus is doing something that we don't often do. I think when we have to face something that we don't want to face, or when we're experiencing that level of stress, we tend to hide ourselves away. We tend to withdraw from people. We tend to withdraw from God because we sometimes see him as part of the problem. We have trouble because part of us knows that maybe God might be allowing this thing to unfold in front of us, and so we pull away. But not Jesus. Jesus chooses to engage. He engages with brutal honesty. I don't want to do this, God. I don't want to face this. Take it away. If it's possible for this hour to pass by. Jesus is saying, God, you can do all that. Like all things are possible. So you could just fast forward 3 or 4 days. We could just jump to the resurrection power part. That's what he's asking for right here. And don't we wish the same thing? God, can we just fast forward? Can we just push the remote button and skip till we see the thumbnail of the next scene when things are better? Can we do that with life, please? I felt that way. I've had bad times where I've literally said, listen, I'm going to go to sleep, and if I'm lucky, I'll wake up in a year, and things will be better. Have you ever been there? Where you're almost, your body just shuts down. You're like, you know what? I'm going to sleep right now. Maybe there'll be some sort of Rip Van Winkle effect, and I'll wake up, and things will be okay. Jesus says that, brutally honest. Will you just take this away from me? Verse 36, he goes, Abba, Father. Now, many of you might know this. Abba is Aramaic. It means daddy. It's a very relational term. He's saying, Daddy, Father. Translation is he's saying, Father, I know you love me like a son, like I'm your child. I know that. I know you care about me. See, he's appealing to God's love as a father. And then he appeals to another quality in his argument for why God should give him what he wants, right? Children do this. They appeal, right? I know you're such a good father. I know you're very powerful. And that's what he says. Everything is possible for you. He's saying you're powerful. You can do all things. You can make this all go away with the snap of your fingers. And because of these two qualities, I'm going to ask you to do something, God. He says this. Next, continue on. Take this cup from me. This cup is a reference maybe to the cup we talked about last week. It's a cup of suffering. Him going to the cross, taking sin upon himself. The utter feeling of aloneness and forsakenness that awaits him on the cross. Now, he's not saying let's skip over it. He's saying let's just take this all away. Will you just do that? I know you love me. I know you're powerful. Will you just remove this? Will you just do that? Please, please. And then Jesus says an unbelievable word. See what it is? Yet. But. Yet not what I will, but what you will. Now, before we get into what that means, I saw this right away. This is where I saw that Jesus' will was not the same as the Father's will. Do you see that? Not what I will, but what you will. This is the time that Jesus did not want to do what the Father had planned for him to do. Just like there are times when we don't want to go through what God has put in front of us to go through, to do. And we think that that's bad, to feel that way. But if that's bad, then Jesus did a bad thing. He was bad. Because he didn't want to do what the Father had put before him to do. And that's okay. And that's okay if that's how you feel about whatever situation happens to be landing in front of you today. It's okay to feel that way. But even when Jesus prays this, I don't think he's changing his will. I don't think he's changing his mind on this one. I don't think Jesus is saying, you know what? After all these tears and flailing about and falling around in front of my friends, I actually feel better. That was pretty cathartic. You know what, God? I think we're going to do it your way. I think that's a great idea. It's going to be great. You know what? I was wrong. Thanks for the time of prayer. It doesn't say that here. It doesn't say that he changed his will. What he says is that he's going to set his will aside. He says, not my will. It's still not what I want. But I'm going to choose what you want. I'm going to choose what you want, Father. And if you decide to not take this away, then okay. I still don't want it, but okay. How did Jesus do that? How did he get there? I think it's actually an ironic twist. You see, the same thing that Jesus was appealing to when he was praying are the same reasons why he can trust in his Father's will over his own. Jesus appealed to God as a father, a loving father who loves and cares for him, and he appealed to God as being powerful. And it's those same two qualities that lead him to trust God's will over his own. How ironic is that? See, at the same time that he's asking the Father to take the situation away, he's remembering that God does love him and that God does have the power to change. And if God is choosing not to change the situation and to remove Jesus from it, if he's allowing Jesus to go through it, then as a loving Father, this must be the best. And however, in God's wisdom, he determines what best is. Jesus makes that step of faith, to trust that God knows best. He tips his hand, actually, of this truth the next day. The next day, when he's in the hands of Pilate, Pilate says to Jesus, "Don't you know that I have the power to free you and the power to crucify you?" And Jesus says, "No, you don't. You only have the power that my Father has given you." Jesus knew who was in control, who was allowing this to happen. And because he knew his Father, his Abba, he knew that at the end of the day, his Father would do what was best. And at the end of the day, because of that, Jesus knew he was right. It was through the cross that Jesus would be glorified. And through the cross, salvation would come to all people, to all humanity. And when Jesus finished, we see that this wasn't just how Jesus handled stress, anxiety, and difficulty, but he was modeling this for you and for me. We see this through what happens next in the passage, verse 37. He returned to his disciples and found them sleeping. "Simon," he said to Peter, "are you asleep? Couldn't you keep watch for 1 hour? Watch and pray so that you will not fall into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak." Jesus was saying to them that he knew for himself, he knew how to handle these moments of weakness. He was a human being in weakness and in flesh, and he knew he wasn't going to get through what he was about to do without being dependent upon God, without God's help and God's strength, the strength and the help of his Father. And he was saying to them, there's no way you're going to get through your struggles unless you go to God in dependent prayer. Crazy. Jesus, this is crazy to me. Jesus is facing death, and he is still being a master teacher to his disciples. That's the secret for you and I to know today. When we feel overwhelmed, when we're so distressed, when we fall to the ground in our weakness, how do we respond? By withdrawing? By pulling away? By stop responding to emails? By stopping to connect with other people? Without praying? Getting angry at God? No. We do so by following our Master's example, by engaging. We engage in prayer that's brutally honest. God, this is awful. What I'm going through is terrible, and I cannot see a good thing coming out of it. God, I want this to end, and you could make it end, and I want you to make it end. God, I don't see the solution to these problems, and I'm no fool. I'm pretty smart, but I don't know how this is going to work out. I hope you have a plan. Brutal honesty with God. Appealing to his love and appealing to his character. Actually, if you want examples of this, you just go to the Psalms. In fact, Jesus on the cross, he starts reciting these Psalms. Psalms that express hardship and struggle and lament, but at the end of the day, trusting and having faith in the goodness and the power of God. That's what Jesus does. He goes again and again, as long as it takes, and that's our example, to go to God as long as it takes, to lay out how we feel, to lay out what our need is, and be able to do that until we can get to the point that we can say, I've spoken and I've said my piece, God, and now I can trust, because you are a loving Father, because you are good, and because you are powerful, I can trust what will happen next in this situation. And if you're calling me to go through this, as difficult as it may be, I know I can. That's what he was trying to tell his disciples. Those 3 men that he took with him, all of them would be challenged in the same way that Jesus is being challenged here. Challenged for their lives. And he wanted them to say, you need to know how to prepare your heart and prepare your mind to go through difficulty. It's an example for them, and it's an example for you and I. I don't know how you're feeling about the world right now. I don't know how you feel about being cooped up in your house. I know my friends who are even introverts are saying, okay, this is pushing it. I don't know how you're feeling with the anxiety of all the things, of the threat to our health and to our finances and our livelihoods and food and necessities and all of this stuff that somehow has suddenly been thrown up into the air. And listen, some of us just naturally are already in our lives are dealing with anxiety. And now this, right? So I am not going to minimize what's happening now and say, oh, just toughen up. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Listen, some of you feel overwhelmed with anxiety. Overwhelmed with the struggle that you face. Overwhelmed by the possibility that the ones you love might get this virus and that it might take their lives. Overwhelmed about the thoughts of the simple math of what's coming in now as far as income and what's being asked of you as far as expenses. Some of you, you were there before, and now it seems like it's at a fever pitch. You can understand why Jesus was falling down as he prayed, because sometimes you feel weak in your knees. You walk around with the knot in your belly. I'm not going to minimize any of that. And I'm not going to say I know the path for you, what God is asking you to do in this time. I do know this. Jesus gives us an example. You and I can go and we can meet with our Father in heaven. And we can be honest, brutally honest. We can make our case. And then we can trust and have faith that no matter what the path is, that he will be with us and give us the strength to do it. Jesus showed insane strength and courage in the next 24 hours of his life in a way that you and I might think was supernatural, but it was not. It was not. Nothing Jesus did on the day he died was supernatural. It was all an expression of our full humanness, submitted and trusting and believing in the goodness of God. That's what got him through. And that's what will get you through. I don't know if you believe. I don't know if you're a Christian or not. And if you're listening to this and you're not, I'm so glad that you are. And so glad that you have this open mind and heart to listen. I will tell you something. Paul once said, the message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing. What he's saying is, in our own natural self, the cross doesn't make much sense. Seems kind of crazy that this man Jesus had to die. And he said, yet it's the power of God to those who are being saved. And that's a transformation in a person's life that I can't make happen. I don't even know if you can make it happen, to be honest with you. It requires a dependence and a trust. And it actually requires that the Spirit of God begins awakening something inside of you. Maybe as difficult as this time is right now, maybe this is the setting in which God will awaken something in you. To awaken many of us to the reality is that we are way more dependent on things outside of ourselves than we ever knew. And that's the message of the cross, is to say this, that you and I, through sin and death and rebellion in this world, we've been cut off from a true living relationship with God. Not because that was his desire, but it's because it was ours, to do things on our own way. And because of that, we're enjoying the world we live in now, for better or worse. And yet in God's grace, not because of anything we've done, but out of his great love, he came down to this earth, entered into human flesh by the name of Jesus. He lived a life that was a model to you and I, and was also a declaration that God still cares, and God still loves humanity, and God will make the way. And so those of us who call ourselves Christians are ones who simply trust in that. That it's not because we're good and we followed all the rules or that we're living the perfect life. Not that. No, that's religion. And that's an issue of us trying to work our way in. Those who are Christian recognize that working will never get there. But that God has offered a free gift. He's offered us this grace that we cannot earn. And so maybe this time where we realize how much is outside of our control, maybe this is the fertile ground where God might awaken your heart to your desperate need to know your Father and your Creator. And maybe, just maybe, you'll respond to that. And maybe your prayer will look like Jesus falling onto the ground because of your great need. It might be a lot more subtle than that. It might just be a calm and quiet, yes, Lord. I recognize that I need you. I need you for life, to live. And I need you for help, and I need you for forgiveness. I need you for new life. I need you for the power and strength to live differently than I've been living. I'm hoping that's the case. Why are we going through what we're going through right now? I don't know. But I do know that the comfort and the power of God is available to us, to everyone who reaches out to him. Let me pray. God, we thank you for this message, this word from Mark, and this example from our master teacher, Jesus. Help us to live this way, to pray this way, and to trust, and to set aside our will, trusting and knowing that you are a good Father, and God, that you are all-powerful, and yet you are allowing us to go through difficulty and trial, and that there is a greater good that comes out of that. Help us to trust in your will wherever that leads. For those who are going to trust you and maybe take the first step of faith in following you, God, may your Spirit speak to their spirit to help them know that they are saved and loved and cherished by you, that they have new life in you, and help them get connected to our community of faith as we grow and follow you together. We thank you for your word and thank you for this life that you have given us. We pray it in Jesus' name. Amen. Grace and peace, everybody. We'll see you soon.